somehow they transcend into tragedy.
Happy Halloween, friends. And if we are not yet friends, then my name is Daniel Watkins, and welcome to Between the Dials, a project where we attempt to plot a long, strange roadmap through the dark heart of Los Angeles, in an attempt to discover a hidden geography that sits right atop our own. And thankfully, if you are a Halloween person like myself, then Los Angeles is the perfect place to be. And if you were with us last Halloween, then you know exactly what kind of trip you are in for today. Typically, I pride myself on conducting rather exhaustive research on the subjects that I speak to you about, and I try my best to separate the stories from the myths. But today is different. Today is the day where we print the legend, as they say, and explore some of Los Angeles's most famous hauntings. And since our current series concerns the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, I figured our ghost stories should as well. But before we start, I thought it would be nice to pay some respect to the patron saint of the holiday, Mila Nurmi, who is best known for portraying Vampira on KABC TV from 1954 to 1955, and who is buried right here, just a couple spots down from David Lynch and across the street from the Garden of Legends. Vampira was television's first horror host, and despite only being on local television for 1 year, her legacy has reverberated across decades. It was through her and her many imitators, Elvira, that we saw the introduction of many of the schlocky, Poverty Row monster movies that so many of us have used to form the basis of our personalities. She herself was also an actor in perhaps the schlocky monster movie, Edward D. Wood Jr.'s Plan 9 from Outer Space. And, not for nothing, but she was also the inspiration for Maleficent in Disney's Sleeping Beauty. Mila was a true Hollywood character and led an incredibly interesting life that was, though sometimes detrimental to her own success, completely free of compromise. She had a baby with Orson Welles, which she gave up for adoption, and she was friends with James Dean until his death in 1955. In fact, one of their favorite hobbies, shall we say, was sneaking into the funeral parlor at this very cemetery to get an close view of the freshly prepared bodies.
I've often been asked why I don't light my attic with electricity. Isn't that ridiculous? Everybody knows electricity is for chairs. Our little fairy tale tonight.
After her show was taken off the air, she would never appear on television on a regular basis again. By the 1960s, she worked as a linoleum installer and occasional house cleaner. She made and sold clothing on the side as well. In fact, Grace Slick and Frank Zappa were said to be regular clients. She sadly died in relative poverty in 2008, and there are no existing kinetoscopes of the original Vampira show with which to mourn her. However, all that said, this is still my favorite gravesite at the cemetery, and I just wanted to show it to you on account of the holiday. Now, before we begin, I do not swear to the validity of any of what you are about to hear. And really, how could I? So much of what you are about to hear concerns incidents in which our corporeal world momentarily overlaps with the world beyond the veil. Do you believe in ghosts? If you do, then you are already in the right mindset for this evening. If you don't, well, I encourage you to at least entertain the possibility, because, after all, what good is a ghost story without a little bit of buy-in? But without any more pretense, if we are facing Mila Nurmi's grave, let's turn to our left and begin walking towards Douglas Fairbanks. We are heading to the very end of this lawn, and once you get to the corner, you will see a large tomb marked Norton. This is the final resting place of Mary Frances Norton, who was born in Petaluma in 1863 and has been here since 1934. Or at least some of her has. Let's flash forward to April 16th, 1986. It's a balmy spring night after a hot April shower, and the cemetery has long since closed for the day. Two friends, Eric and Ronald, both in their early 20s, had no problem jumping the gate. And frankly, security probably wouldn't have cared one way or the other, because, just as a reminder to those who have been following our series, this is during the tenure in Jules Roth's ownership of the cemetery, where they were pulling in more money in disinterment fees than they were anything else. Because families of the deceased were so disgusted with the upkeep of the grounds that they preferred to have their loved ones dug up so that they could be buried somewhere else. When Ronald and Eric drop to the other side of the gate, it's about 2:30 in the morning, and the air is hot and breezeless, and as such, Due to the way Roth was running the place, the smell of literal decay hung heavy in the air. However, they didn't mind that so much. In fact, for their purposes tonight, the smell of rotting flesh may well have been akin to the smell of cold, hard cash. As the Hollywood punk scene was giving way to the Hollywood metal scene, the city became flush with a new crop of morbidly minded artists who were willing to pay handsomely for a ghoulish souvenir or two. That's right, if you haven't guessed by now, Ronald and Eric were good old-fashioned grave robbers who would regularly troll this poorly guarded cemetery like their own personal gold mine. And this April night was no different. They knew enough to keep off of the roads that run through the grounds, but that meant trudging through knee-high, overgrown grass, not knowing if their next step was going to land them in a soggy pocket of mud with enough suction to pop off their shoes. Or at least they told themselves it was mud. No way to really tell in the middle of the night. But they pressed on until they came to the mausoleum that we currently stand before. Ronald grabbed a rock and smashed open the decaying lock that hung loose on the iron door. And with that, they were in. If they thought the air in the cemetery was bad, inside the cramped tomb, it was barely breathable. The smell stung their nostrils and caused Eric to retch and gag. Ronald just laughed and pushed the marble lid atop the tomb just wide enough for him to be able to get his arm inside. And then in went his arms, into the inky blackness of the tomb, fishing around through standing water until he found something to grab a hold of. And by the size of it, it seemed as though he had hit the jackpot. Once he had a handle on it, Ronald pulled out his arms, and with it came a human skull. Mary Norton's skull, to be exact, and he knew that someone out there was going to pay top dollar for it. Hell, he might even have a bidding war on his hands. Ronald produced a plastic Ralph's bag from his pocket, opened it up, and slid the head inside. Time to make their exit. Eric and Ronald began walking out the way they came, through the tall grass, through the mud-like substance, back towards the direction of the gate. But something felt off about the return journey. The two walked and walked, but the gate was nowhere in sight. It seemed as though they had more than doubled the original distance, and it was feeling as though they may have lost their way in the inky blackness of the night. Their legs were getting tired. Eric cracked his knee against a tombstone, and that brought the two to a halt. They needed to regroup and get their bearings and maybe even talk a little bit of courage back into themselves. And that is when they began to hear whispers. Faint at first, but still undeniable. It was clear that they were not the only ones trolling the cemetery tonight. And this whispering felt very close. Whoever was sharing the night with Eric and Ronald was right on top of them. They looked around, and granted it was pretty dark, but surely if someone were close enough that they could hear them whispering, then Eric and Ronald should be able to see them. Perhaps even ask them the quickest way out. But, as you have probably already guessed, there was no one there. No one living, at least, because the whispering was coming from the bag containing Mary Norton's head. They leaned in close, and sure enough, Mary appeared to be speaking, but they couldn't quite make out what she was trying to say. Eric was adamant that they just drop the thing and start running, but Ronald, blinded by the potential for a big payoff, said absolutely not. She wasn't talking. It was either the wind or some teenagers making out or something, and to prove this to his friend, Ronald reached into the bag and produced the skull, which was still wet and glistened in the moonlight. They stared into its hollow eyes and leaned in close. Then closer, and then closer still, until their ears were almost pressed against its temples. That's when Mary Norton started screaming, and everything went black. Ronald awoke the next morning outside the cemetery gates on the ground. Eric was nowhere to be found. The skull had rolled under a parked car, and standing before him were two security guards, who seemed more amused than angry. Ronald tried to explain himself, but they stopped him and said, "Your friend already told us everything. We found him passed out on the other side of the cemetery." Then they told him to grab the skull and escorted him back to Mary's tomb, where he tossed it back inside with a wet splash. So, I guess Mary Norton is all here after all. Just maybe not in the right order, but let's digress and make a left and head towards a place that we have been to a few times already this season. The Cathedral Mausoleum. Because it's time to talk about Rudolph Valentino. We'll pass by Douglas Fairbanks, of course. A few weeks ago, we talked about Pickfair, the home that he owned with his second wife and silent-era star Mary Pickford. But what I merely alluded to was that Pickfair was famously haunted. Mary got the mansion and the divorce, and soon her new husband, Buddy Rogers, moved in. By then, movies talked, and her work had long dried up. She became a recluse, sold her stake in United Artists in 1956, and died in 1979. Buddy decided to stay, and now he was all alone in that massive house. And that is when things got weird. Buddy and his friends reported seeing the hazy figure of a woman wandering the halls on the bottom floor. It wasn't Mary. Gossip columns at the time claimed it was the spirit of a maid who had committed suicide in the home, but no supporting records of that exist that I can find. A second spirit, however, was also reported to inhabit the mansion. This one, in a long gown, was said to traverse the second floor landing. That one was Mary. Pickfair was sold in 1980 to Lakers owner Jerry Boss, and he reported seeing Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. I guess he was trying to claim in death what he lost in the divorce. In 1988, the home was sold once again to Pia Zadora, who promptly razed it to the ground. Sadly, it was apparently in pretty bad shape by then, and it seems that when the house was eliminated, so were the hauntings. The new home on the grounds has reported nothing in the way of the paranormal. Today, all that remains of the original Pickfair is the swimming pool and the iron gate with the letter P. Anyway, Valentino. To get to his tomb, we are going to walk to the last series of hallways as though we were going to visit Jules Roth or William Desmond Taylor. But instead of going down their corridor, we are going to head in the opposite direction. You'll know you're in the right place when you start to see the flowers. Valentino's grave is almost always covered in flowers. Partially because ever since his sudden death from complications related to a stomach surgery in 1926, a mysterious woman in a black veil and dress has visited his tomb on the anniversary of his passing, to leave a single red rose. Today, she now leads a procession of copycats. Now, conventional wisdom tells us that there is no way that the woman who visits him these days is the same one who began the yearly pilgrimage in 1926. But there is no way to empirically disprove that either. And that is because the identity of the original Lady in Black has never been divulged. However, the prevailing theory is that the original mourner was a woman named Deetra Flame, who was an orphan adopted by a family in Hollywood, who changed her name to Princess Orvella Wilson. Rudolph Valentino, she claimed, was a family friend, and even once visited her in the hospital when she was a teenager, giving her a single rose and asking her to return the favor should he ever die. And that is what started it all. Her regular visits ceased in 1954 when the attention she achieved as a folk icon had become a little too intrusive. She made her last visit in 1981 and passed away the following year from heart disease. Many others have laid claim to the Lady in Black moniker, but as far as I can tell, she was the first. But if we give credence to the idea that the vitality of a spirit beyond the veil is contingent on how many of the living still hold his or her memory, then these litany of mourners may account for how active Valentino has been in death. His ghost has been seen at all of the hotspots, and of course here at Hollywood Forever, and funny story about that. There were plans to build a massive monument for Valentino upon his death, so the place where he currently rests was only meant to be temporary. A friend of his had 2 plots, and she agreed to loan one to Valentino while his monument was being constructed. She, however, also died before the memorial could be completed, so instead of belaboring the situation, Valentino's family purchased his temporary plot from his friend's estate, and the temporary became permanent. One of the statues intended for the memorial was later installed in DeLongpre Park in 1930. And in 1931, a young woman was murdered on the bench right in front of it. Probably unrelated, but it felt wrong not to mention it. He also haunts Musso and Frank. There, he likes to lurk around the restrooms. Women who have gone in claim to see him lingering in the doorway, smiling. His home at the time of his death, a place called Falcon Lair, located at 10051 Cielo Drive, yes, that's right across from the home that Sharon Tate shared with Roman Polanski, is said to be another hotspot. Immediately after Valentino passed away, the caretaker of Falcon Lair began conducting seances and ghost tours for the benefit of paying thrill seekers. Though this was most assuredly a scam, Valentino has been seen roaming the halls of his former home, and even passers-by have said they have seen him looking through the window out at the city. Security guards at Paramount Studios, right next door to Hollywood Forever, say that they have witnessed Rudolph Valentino pass through the wall that separates the cemetery and just meander around the studio lot. He seems to prefer the costume department, they say, though it's worth noting that Valentino never made a film at this location. During his time, if you'll remember from our series on William Desmond Taylor, the Lasky Paramount lot was located on Vine Street, occupying the block between Sunset Boulevard and Selma, so maybe he's just curious to see how people are making movies nowadays. He's also been seen at several of his other homes, including the former site of his Hollywood villa located on Laurel Avenue, right across from where Schwab's used to be. Like many, Valentino also has a presence at the Knickerbocker Hotel, which actually wasn't completed until 3 years after Valentino died, so your guess is as good as mine as to how that whole thing works. But like I said, he seems to be one of Los Angeles's more well-traveled spirits. Even the Lady in Black has been the subject of a few non-corporeal sightings. Tourists looking to leave a rose of their own have turned the corner to find the vision of a woman in a black dress and veil, sobbing in front of Valentino's tomb. Feeling a little self-conscious, they avert their eyes over their shoulder, only to find that when they return their gaze to the tomb, that the woman in black has completely vanished, leaving behind only the scent of roses. So, it's Halloween. After you take a drive by Falcon's Lair to see if Valentino is in the window, I can't encourage you enough to pay the cemetery a visit. Not like Eric and Ronald, though, no. Right about now, they should be setting up for their annual Day of the Dead celebration, so swing by and leave a rose for Valentino, and then check out some of the offenders. Hollywood Forever holds more ghosts, but unfortunately this is all the time we have today. After all, I have my own Halloween to prepare for, but if you happen to find yourself in the cemetery after dark, then be sure to keep an ear out for any screaming skulls. And as always, please do drive safely. Between the Dial was written, produced, and narrated by me, Daniel Watkins. If you like the music you are listening to right now, that is by Chestnut. And if you are looking to get into the Halloween spirit, then Christina Santa Cruz and I are going to be marathoning horror movies all Halloween day and night over on landturtlerecords.com. That's landturtlerecords.com. Tune in anytime, and I'm sure you'll find something you'll like. Have a good night, y'all.